The conference room fell silent. Irene Hill's hands trembled slightly as she held up the printed report, her security audit that had taken 3 weeks to complete. "This vulnerability needs immediate attention," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. Her supervisor leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a condescending smile playing at his lips. "You're overreacting," he said dismissively. "We've been fine for years. This is just theoretical paranoia." The other team members shifted uncomfortably. Irene felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from frustration. She knew she was right. What she didn't know was that in exactly 3 hours and 17 minutes, every word of her warning would prove devastatingly accurate. And when chaos erupted, she would be the only one standing between her company and complete digital annihilation. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more. The morning had started like any other Tuesday at Sentinel Data Solutions, a mid-sized cybersecurity firm nestled in the heart of Brussels. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the modern office building, casting geometric patterns across the polished floors. Irene Hill arrived at 7:30, as she always did, a full hour before most of her colleagues. At 26, she was one of the youngest security analysts on the team, and she felt the constant need to prove herself in an industry that often dismissed youth as inexperience. She set her canvas bag down at her desk, pulled out her laptop, and immediately opened the document she'd been refining all weekend. The security audit had consumed her thoughts for weeks. She'd run penetration tests, analyzed network traffic patterns, and reviewed authentication protocols until her eyes burned. What she'd discovered kept her awake at night, a critical vulnerability in their client portal's authentication system. It wasn't obvious, which made it even more dangerous. The flaw existed in how the system handled session tokens during multi-factor authentication requests. A sophisticated attacker could exploit the millisecond gap between authentication stages to inject malicious code. Her colleague, Thomas, arrived at 8:15, dropping his motorcycle helmet on his desk with a thud. "You're here early again," he observed, grabbing his coffee mug. "Did you sleep at all this weekend?" "I finished the audit," Irene replied, not looking up from her screen. "Thomas, this is serious. We have a critical vulnerability that could compromise every client account in our system." Thomas walked over, peering at her monitor. He was 34, had been with the company for 6 years, and had a relaxed attitude that sometimes bordered on complacency. "You're always finding something serious," he said with a chuckle. "Remember last month when you thought the backup system was compromised? Turned out to be a false alarm." Irene's jaw tightened. "That was different. This is real. I've tested it multiple ways. An attacker with intermediate skills could exploit this within minutes of identifying it." "If you say so," Thomas said, walking away. "Good luck with the meeting." The meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock. Irene had requested it specifically to present her findings to the security team leadership. Her direct supervisor, Henrik Vandenberg, would be there, along with the head of IT operations and 2 senior analysts. She'd prepare a presentation with clear evidence, step-by-step exploitation scenarios, and recommended remediation strategies. She'd even drafted a timeline showing they could patch the vulnerability within 48 hours if they acted immediately. As 9 o'clock approached, Irene gathered her materials and headed to conference room B. The room was all glass and chrome, with a large oval table and a screen for presentations. Henrik was already there, scrolling through his phone. He was in his mid-40s, with graying hair and an air of permanent skepticism. He'd been in cybersecurity since before Irene was born, and he never let anyone forget it. "Morning, Irene," he said without looking up. "Let's make this quick. I have a client call at 9:30. The others filtered in, David from IT operations, and senior analysts Laura and James. Irene connected her laptop to the display and pulled up her presentation. Her heart was pounding, but she'd learned to channel her nervousness into focus. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her accent carrying the slight musical quality of her Italian mother's influence mixed with her Belgian upbringing. I've identified a critical security vulnerability in our client portal authentication system. This isn't theoretical, I've successfully exploited it in our testing environment. She clicked to the next slide, showing a diagram of the authentication flow. The vulnerability exists in how we handle session tokens during the MFA verification process. There's a window of approximately 200 milliseconds where an attacker can intercept and manipulate the authentication state. Henrik barely glanced at the screen. How did you discover this? I was reviewing our authentication logs and noticed some anomalous patterns in session token generation. When I investigated further, I found the gap in our validation sequence. And you tested this, how? Henrik's tone suggested he already doubted her methodology. I created an isolated testing environment that mirrors our production setup. I was able to bypass authentication and gain unauthorized access to a test account within 4 minutes. James, one of the senior analysts, leaned forward with interest. 4 minutes? That's concerning. What's the attack vector? Irene felt a flash of gratitude. At least someone was taking her seriously. An attacker would need to intercept the initial authentication request, which isn't difficult if they've compromised the local network or if a user is on unsecured Wi-Fi. From there, they can inject code that exploits the token validation gap. Henrik sighed heavily. Irene, do you know how many critical vulnerabilities get reported every day that turn out to be nothing? Our authentication system has been in place for 3 years. We've had external audits. If this was really a problem, don't you think someone would have found it by now? With respect, sir, this type of vulnerability is exactly what external audits often miss because it requires very specific conditions and deep knowledge of our particular implementation. So you're saying you're smarter than the professional auditors we paid €50,000? Henrik's voice had an edge now. Irene felt her cheeks flush. I'm not saying that. I'm saying I had time to conduct deep analysis of our specific codebase, which a general audit might not prioritize. Laura spoke up, her voice measured. Henrik, maybe we should at least review our findings in detail. If there's even a chance. There's always a chance of something, Henrik interrupted. But we can't shut down systems and panic clients every time someone has a theory. Irene, you're passionate about security, and that's admirable. But you need to understand the business side. We can't afford to be reactionary. I'm not being reactionary, Irene insisted, struggling to keep her voice calm. I've spent 3 weeks on this. I have documentation, test results, proof of concept. Henrik held up his hand. Enough. Look, I appreciate the work you've put in, but I've seen this before. Young analysts get obsessed with finding the next big threat. It's good instinct, but you're overreacting. This is theoretical paranoia, not a genuine risk. The words hit Irene like a physical blow. Theoretical paranoia. She glanced around the table. David from IT looked uncomfortable but said nothing. James seemed conflicted but deferred to Henrik's authority. Laura offered her a sympathetic look but remained silent. I really think we should, Irene tried again. We're done here, Henrik said, standing up. I have that client call. Thank you for the presentation, but we're not going to pursue this further right now. If you want to write up a formal report, fine, we'll add it to the queue for the next quarterly review. But we're not implementing emergency patches based on a hypothetical scenario. He walked out. The others followed, leaving Irene standing alone in the conference room, her presentation still displayed on the screen, her carefully gathered evidence dismissed in less than 15 minutes. Irene stood in the empty conference room for a long moment, staring at her presentation on the screen. 3 weeks of work. Hundreds of hours of analysis. Concrete evidence. All dismissed as theoretical paranoia. She felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she'd had throughout her career whenever her expertise was questioned simply because she was young, or because she was a woman, or because she showed emotion when she was passionate about something. She disconnected her laptop with more force than necessary and returned to her desk. Thomas glanced over. How'd it go? He didn't listen, Irene said flatly. Henrik never listens to anyone on the first try, Thomas replied. Give it time. Maybe bring it up again next month. Next month. Irene wanted to scream. Security vulnerabilities didn't wait for convenient timing. They didn't care about quarterly reviews or client calls. But she'd learned that sometimes there was nothing you could do when people refused to listen. She opened her email and began drafting the formal report Henrik had mentioned. At least she'd have documentation that she'd tried to warn them. She worked with fierce concentration, detailing every aspect of the vulnerability, including mitigation strategies and implementation timelines. If, when something happened, no one would be able to say she hadn't raised the alarm. At 11:30, she sent the report to Henrik and copied the entire security team. Then she returned to her regular work queue, trying to focus on routine security monitoring and ticket responses. But her mind kept returning to that vulnerability. She'd seen the gap in the system. She knew it was exploitable. The question wasn't if someone would find it, but when. The office buzzed with normal Tuesday activity. The marketing team was having a loud discussion about a campaign. Someone's phone kept ringing. The coffee machine gurgled in the break room. Sunlight continued streaming through those tall windows, illuminating a workplace that felt secure but wasn't. Irene tried to shake off the sense of impending disaster. Maybe Henrik was right. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe. Her phone buzzed. A system alert. She grabbed it, her pulse quickening. Unusual network traffic pattern detected. Client portal authentication system. Irene's blood went cold. She immediately opened her security monitoring dashboard, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The timestamp on the alert showed it had begun 17 minutes ago. The system had flagged it as anomalous but not critical, so it had gone through the standard notification delay. Her screens filled with data. Someone was probing their authentication system. Not a random scan. Not automated testing. This was targeted, methodical. Someone was mapping their security infrastructure, looking for exactly the kind of weakness she'd identified. No, she whispered, pulling up the traffic logs. The probing was sophisticated. Whoever was doing this knew what they were looking for. They were testing response times, mapping the authentication flow, analyzing the same patterns she'd identified in her audit. She grabbed her desk phone and called Henrik's extension. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Henrik, this is Irene. We have unusual traffic on the client portal. It matches the vulnerability pattern I presented this morning. Please call me back immediately. She tried his mobile. No answer. She checked the company calendar. He was in that client meeting and had probably silenced his phone. Irene's mind raced. Standard protocol would be to escalate to the Security Operations Center, but their SOC was outsourced and had a response time of 30 to 60 minutes for non-critical alerts. By then, if this was what she thought it was, the damage would be done. She pulled up the live authentication logs, watching in real time as the probing continued. The attacker was being careful, spacing their attempts to avoid triggering the more obvious security alerts. But Irene could see the pattern. They were closing in on the vulnerability. They'd found the authentication flow. Now they were testing the timing of the MFA process. Thomas, she called out, her voice sharp enough to make several heads turn. I need you to look at something. He wheeled his chair over, his casual demeanor evaporating when he saw her expression. What's wrong? Someone's probing our authentication system. Look at these patterns. She pointed to her screen. They're testing the exact vulnerability I presented this morning. Thomas leaned in, his eyes scanning the data. Could be coincidence. We get probes all the time. Not like this. Look at the timing intervals. Look at the specific endpoints they're targeting. This isn't random. As they watched, a new pattern emerged in the logs. The attacker had moved from probing to testing. They were attempting to exploit the vulnerability. I need to contact Henrik, Thomas said, reaching for his phone. I already tried. He's in a meeting. Irene's mind was working at full speed, running through options. We need to act now. We can implement a temporary mitigation, tighten the token validation window, add additional logging, temporarily disable the affected MFA pathway and force users to the backup authentication method. We can't make that call without authorization, Thomas protested. If we disrupt client access without approval. If we don't act, we could have a complete breach. Irene's voice rose, emotion breaking through her professional composure. Several coworkers were now looking over at them. Irene, calm down, Thomas said, glancing around nervously. Let's follow protocol. I'll keep trying to reach Henrik. You document everything you're seeing. There's no time for protocol. Irene felt tears of frustration threatening. She blinked them back furiously. She couldn't cry now. Not when she needed to be taken seriously. In 15 minutes, maybe less, they're going to successfully exploit this vulnerability, and then we'll handle it according to our incident response plan, Thomas said firmly. I know you're worried, but we have procedures for a reason. Irene stared at him, realization sinking in. He wasn't going to help her. Even now, with evidence mounting on her screen, the response was to wait, to follow procedure, to defer to authority. She thought about all the times in her career when she'd been told to calm down, to be patient, to trust the process. And she thought about how many of those times, she'd been right. She made a decision. Fine, she said, turning back to her computer. You keep trying, Henrik. I'll document everything. Thomas nodded, satisfied, and returned to his desk, phone already to his ear. Irene waited until he was focused on his call, then opened a secure terminal window. She had administrative access to the authentication system, all the senior analysts did, for exactly this kind of emergency. The question was whether she had the courage to use it without authorization. Her hands hovered over the keyboard. If she implemented the mitigation and she was wrong, if this turned out to be nothing, or if her actions disrupted legitimate client access, she could lose her job. Henrik would certainly fire her for insubordination. But if she was right, and she did nothing. On her screen, the attack pattern intensified. The attacker had refined their approach. They were seconds away from finding the exact timing window they needed. Irene took a deep breath and began typing. Her fingers moved with absolute certainty now, implementing the emergency protocols she designed in her audit. She tightened the token validation window from 200 milliseconds to 50. She enabled maximum logging on all authentication attempts. She routed all MFA requests through the backup pathway while preserving user sessions to avoid disrupting active connections. The changes took 90 seconds to implement. As soon as they went live, she watched the attack pattern on her screen change. The attacker tried their exploit. It failed. They tried again with slight modifications. Failed again. They were locked out of the vulnerability she'd identified. But Irene's relief lasted only a moment. Because as she watched the logs, a new pattern emerged. The attacker wasn't giving up. They'd hit a wall on the authentication exploit, and now they were pivoting, trying different vectors, probing other potential weaknesses. This wasn't a casual opportunist. This was a determined, skilled attacker who had targeted Sentinel data solutions specifically. And the battle was just beginning. Irene's eyes darted across multiple monitors as the attacker's strategy shifted. They were no longer focused on the authentication system, they'd moved to probing the database query layer. Whoever this was, they understood their infrastructure intimately. Too intimately. She pulled up the IP addresses associated with the attack. They were routing through multiple proxies, bouncing across servers in different countries, standard procedure for sophisticated attackers trying to hide their origin. But there was something about the attack pattern itself, the specific sequence of probes, that nagged at her. Thomas, she called out, keeping her voice level this time. The attack is escalating. They've moved to database probing. He hurried over, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by genuine concern. You implemented the mitigation? I had to. They were seconds away from breaching the authentication system. "Henrik is going to lose his mind when he finds out you made changes without authorization," Thomas said, but there was reluctant admiration in his voice. "Let him. At least we still have a secure system for him to be angry about." Irene's fingers flew across her keyboard, adjusting firewall rules to block the new attack vectors. "I need you to get David from IT operations. We need to isolate the affected systems before they find another way in." Thomas nodded and rushed toward David's desk. Irene continued monitoring, her analytical mind working through possibilities. The attacker knew too much about their specific setup. They weren't using generic scanning tools, they were targeting known weaknesses in Sentinel's particular configuration of security software. A terrible thought occurred to her. What if this wasn't an external attack at all? She pulled up the employee access logs, cross-referencing them with the timeline of the probing activity. Most employees had standard access patterns, logging in during work hours, accessing specific systems related to their roles. But one account showed unusual activity. Someone had been accessing sensitive system documentation over the past 2 weeks, including architecture diagrams and security protocols. The access times were odd, late nights, weekends. The account belonged to someone in their own IT department. Gerard Rousseau, a systems administrator who'd been with the company for 8 months. Irene's stomach churned. She pulled up Gerard's personnel file. He'd come with excellent references, solid experience, passed all background checks. But as she dug deeper into his access patterns, a picture emerged. He'd systematically documented their entire security infrastructure. Every vulnerability, every patch schedule, every authentication flow. "David's coming," Thomas said, returning with the IT operations manager in tow. David looked stressed, his tie loosened, sweat on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Thomas says we have a situation." "What's the scope?" "Major targeted attack," Irene said, pulling up her monitoring dashboard for him to see. "But I think it's not just an attack, I think it's an inside job. Look at this." She showed them Gerard's access patterns. David's face went pale. "Gerard? He's working today. He's in the server room right now doing routine maintenance." The three of them exchanged horrified glances. If Gerard was in the server room with physical access to their core systems, the remote attack could be a distraction. He could be planting backdoors, extracting data, or sabotaging their infrastructure from the inside while they focused on the external threat. "We need to get him out of there," Irene said, standing up. "Now." "We can't just accuse an employee without proof," David protested. "If we're wrong. If we're right and we wait, he could compromise everything we have," Irene interrupted. "David, check the physical access logs. When did Gerard enter the server room?" David pulled out his tablet, accessing the building security system. His face confirmed her fears. 43 minutes ago. Right around when the external probing started. "That's not a coincidence," Thomas said. "The external attack is covering his tracks. While we're focused on the network intrusion, he's got free access to do whatever he wants in the server room." Irene was already moving toward the door. "Call building security. Tell them to lock down the server room, nobody enters or exits. Then call Henrik and tell him to get back here immediately. I'm going down there." "Irene, wait," David started, but she was already gone, running toward the stairwell. The server room was 3 floors down, in the basement level where they kept all critical infrastructure. Her heart pounded as she took the stairs 2 at a time. She had to stop him before he could finish whatever he was doing. Every second counted. The basement corridor was dimly lit, lined with concrete walls and exposed pipes. Irene's footsteps echoed as she ran toward the server room at the end of the hall. The heavy security door was closed but not locked. Gerard had access, of course. She slowed as she approached, trying to catch her breath and think strategically. Confronting him directly could be dangerous. She didn't know if he was working alone or what his intentions were. But she couldn't wait for security or Henrik. She needed to see what he was doing and stop it if necessary. She pulled out her phone and opened the company's security camera app. Every room in the building had surveillance, including the server room. She pulled up the feed, her hands shaking slightly. The camera showed Gerard standing at the main server console, a laptop connected to their primary authentication server. On a screen, she could see code scrolling. He was installing something directly into their system. A backdoor. He was creating permanent access that would survive any password changes or security updates. With this in place, he, or whoever he was working for, could access their entire client database whenever they wanted. Irene's mind raced through options. She could trigger the emergency lockdown system, which would seal the server room and cut all network connections. But that would trap Gerard inside and alert him that he'd been discovered. If he had any kind of dead man's switch or automated script, locking him in could trigger it. She needed a different approach. She opened her laptop and connected to the company VPN remotely. If she could access the authentication server from her admin account, she might be able to see exactly what Gerard was installing and potentially block or remove it before he finished. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, navigating through system directories. There, she could see the backdoor code he was installing. It was sophisticated, designed to look like a legitimate system update. Without careful analysis, no one would notice it was there. But now that she could see it, she could create a script to remove it the moment he disconnected his laptop. The question was timing. If she removed it while he was still connected, he'd know immediately and might have contingency plans. She needed to wait until he thought he'd succeeded and left. Footsteps sounded behind her. She spun around to see building security approaching, 2 guards she recognized, along with David and Thomas. "We got your message," one of the guards said. "Is he still in there?" "Yes, and he's installing a backdoor into our authentication system," Irene whispered. "But we need to be careful. If we spook him before I can neutralize what he's done, he might trigger something worse." David looked at her laptop screen. "Can you remove it remotely?" "I've prepared a script, but I need to time it perfectly. Once he disconnects and thinks he's succeeded, I'll execute the removal. Then security can detain him." They waited in tense silence, watching the security camera feed. Gerard worked methodically, occasionally glancing at his watch. He was following a timeline. After 6 agonizing minutes, he disconnected his laptop, typed a few more commands directly into the server console, and then headed toward the door. "Now," Irene whispered, executing her script. On her laptop, she watched as her code swept through the authentication server, identifying and removing every piece of the backdoor Gerard had installed. It took 12 seconds during which her heart hammered in her chest, praying nothing would go wrong. The script completed successfully. The backdoor was gone. Gerard opened the server room door and stepped into the corridor. He froze when he saw them waiting, Irene with her laptop, David and Thomas flanking her, 2 security guards blocking his exit. "Gerard Rousseau," the lead security guard said, stepping forward. "We need you to come with us. There are some questions about your activities in the server room." Gerard's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, calculation, resignation. For a moment, Irene thought he might run or fight. But then his shoulders sagged. "You figured it out," he said quietly, looking directly at Irene. "How?" "Your access patterns," Irene replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "You spent weeks mapping our security infrastructure. Too thorough, too systematic. When the external attack started, it was too convenient. The external attack was supposed to keep everyone distracted for another 15 minutes, Gerard said bitterly. Just long enough to finish and get out. I underestimated you." "Who are you working for?" David demanded. Gerard smiled grimly. "Does it matter? You'll find out soon enough when the lawyers get involved." He looked at Irene again. "That vulnerability in the authentication system, you found that too, didn't you?" "I was counting on that being my entry point, but someone patched it about an hour ago." "That was me," Irene said. The conference room was crowded and tense. Henrik had rushed back from his client meeting, his face alternating between fury and shock. The head of HR sat beside him, taking notes. Two police officers occupied chairs near the door, waiting to take Gerard into custody once the company finished their internal inquiry. And at the center of it all sat Gerard Rousseau, his employee badge already confiscated, a resignation in his posture that seemed almost like relief. Irene stood near the window, exhausted but alert. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, leaving her shaky and drained. Thomas had brought her a bottle of water, which she sipped slowly, trying to process everything that had happened in the last 3 hours. "Let's start from the beginning," Henrik said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "How long have you been planning this, Gerard?" Gerard leaned back in his chair, seeming to weigh his options. Finally, he spoke. "I was recruited 6 months ago, before I even applied for this job. A competitor, I won't say which one, let my lawyers handle that, wanted inside access to your client database. They wanted to know your security protocols, your vulnerabilities, everything. I was supposed to document it all and then, when the time was right, create a backdoor for permanent access." "And the external attack today?" David asked. "Coordinated timing. Once I had everything mapped, I signaled that I was ready to install the backdoor. The external probing was meant to distract your security team while I worked. Should have been simple." He glanced at Irene with something that might have been respect. "Your analyst here complicated things." Henrik's jaw clenched. He turned to Irene, and she braced herself for the rebuke she knew was coming. "You implemented system changes without authorization," he said. "Yes, sir," Irene replied, meeting his eyes. "I had less than a minute to decide. The attack was about to succeed. You could have disrupted legitimate client access. You could have caused system instability. You violated protocol." "I know." Irene felt the familiar tightness in her chest, but she refused to look away. "But if I hadn't acted, Gerard's external accomplices would have exploited the vulnerability I warned you about this morning. The vulnerability you dismissed as theoretical paranoia." The words hung in the air. Henrik's face reddened. Several people in the room shifted uncomfortably. Irene knew she was risking everything by pushing back, but she was too tired and too angry to stay silent. "That vulnerability," Gerard interjected, almost helpfully, "was going to be our primary access point. When it suddenly got patched, we had to scramble. That's why I went to the server room earlier than planned. I needed physical access since the remote exploit was blocked." Henrik turned away, staring out the window. The silence stretched. Finally, he spoke, his voice different, quieter, less certain. "The audit you presented this morning. I need to see it again. All of it." "I emailed it to you," Irene said. "Complete documentation, test results, mitigation strategies. Forward it to everyone on the security team," Henrik ordered. "David, I want a full system audit. Check every access point Gerard touched. Laura, James, review all recent system changes and employee access patterns. If he was here for 6 months, there might be other issues we haven't found yet." The police officers stood. "We need to take Mr. Rousseau to the station now for formal questioning." As they escorted Gerard out, he paused beside Irene. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "you're wasted here. A company that doesn't listen to analysts like you deserves what it gets." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a definitive click. The room erupted in conversations, HR discussing legal implications, David outlining the audit process, Laura and James arguing about security protocols. Irene stayed by the window, watching the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Brussels. Thomas approached her. "You did good," he said simply. "I violated protocol and defied my supervisor," Irene replied. "You saved the company." Thomas smiled. "There's a difference between following rules and doing what's right. Today you did what was right." Henrik cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. He looked uncomfortable, a man not used to admitting mistakes. "Irene, I need to speak with you privately. The rest of you, begin the audit." I want preliminary results by end of day tomorrow. People filed out until only Irene and Henrik remained. She expected anger, possibly termination. Instead, Henrik sat down heavily, suddenly looking older than his years. 3 hours, he said finally. You tried to warn me 3 hours before all of this happened, and I shut you down. He rubbed his face with both hands. I've been in this business for 20 years. I thought I'd seen everything. I thought young analysts were always overreacting, seeing threats that weren't really there. Sir, Irene began. Let me finish. Henrik looked at her directly. I was wrong. Not just wrong, I was arrogant and dismissive. You did excellent work on that audit, and instead of taking it seriously, I questioned your competence based on, what? Your age? The fact that you were passionate about the findings? That's not leadership. That's ego. Irene didn't know what to say. She'd never heard Henrik admit to being wrong about anything. You saved this company today, Henrik continued. Henrik stood up and walked to the window where Irene had been standing, both of them now looking out at the Brussels skyline. The afternoon light was softening, casting the city in warm amber tones. In the distance, the European Parliament building gleamed. When I started in cybersecurity, Henrik said quietly, it was a different world. Threats were simpler. Solutions were more straightforward. You could rely on established protocols and experience would always win out. He turned to face her. But the landscape has changed. Attacks are more sophisticated. Vulnerabilities are more subtle. And sometimes fresh eyes see what experienced ones miss. Irene listened, still processing the shift in his demeanor. This wasn't the dismissive supervisor from the morning meeting. This was someone who'd been shaken by how close they'd come to disaster. I need to ask you something, Henrik continued. When you were implementing those emergency changes, when you decided to act without authorization, were you afraid? Terrified, Irene admitted. I knew I could be fired. But I was more afraid of what would happen if I did nothing. Henrik nodded slowly. That's the difference between following procedure and having courage. I've spent years teaching my team to follow procedure. Maybe I forgot to teach them when to break it. He moved back to the table, pulling out a chair. Sit down. We need to discuss what happens next. Irene sat, her exhaustion suddenly overwhelming. Now that the immediate crisis had passed, her body was reminding her that she'd been operating on pure adrenaline for hours. First, Henrik said, I'm formally commending you for your actions today. Your quick thinking and decisive response prevented what could have been a catastrophic breach. That goes in your permanent record, along with a written apology from me for dismissing your security audit. Irene blinked. Sir, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Not just because it's the right thing to do, but because if we don't learn from this, we're doomed to repeat it. He pulled out his laptop, typing quickly. I'm also recommending you for immediate promotion to senior security analyst, with a corresponding salary increase. Your audit work and crisis response today demonstrated capabilities well beyond your current position. Henrik, Irene struggled to find words. This morning she'd been dismissed and humiliated. Now she was being promoted. I'm also restructuring how we handle security audits and vulnerability reports, Henrik continued. From now on, any analyst who identifies a potential critical vulnerability gets an immediate review by a panel of senior staff, not just their direct supervisor. We'll establish a fast-track protocol for implementing emergency security measures when time is critical. And we'll be doing mandatory training on recognizing and responding to insider threats. He looked at her seriously. Gerard Rousseau fooled all of us. He had perfect credentials, passed background checks, seemed like an ideal employee. We need to be smarter about monitoring internal access patterns. I'd like you to lead that initiative. Irene's mind was spinning. You want me to develop an insider threat detection system? You're the one who caught him. You saw the patterns that the rest of us missed. Henrik's expression softened slightly. I know this has been an intense day. Take tomorrow off. Rest. process what happened. But when you come back, I want you to start building a comprehensive insider threat program. You'll have resources, budget, and full authorization to implement whatever measures you think necessary. There was a knock on the door. Laura poked her head in. Henrik, the preliminary audit is showing 3 other potential access points that Gerard might have compromised. We need your authorization to shut them down and rebuild those systems. Do it, Henrik said immediately. Whatever it takes. Irene, anything else you think we should check based on Gerard's access patterns? Irene stood, her analytical mind already shifting to the new problem. Check all the system documentation he accessed. If he downloaded architecture diagrams or security protocols, we need to assume his employers have that information. We should consider those systems compromised and rotate all credentials associated with them. Laura nodded, making notes. Good catch. I'll add that to the audit. As Laura left, Henrik extended his hand to Irene. Thank you, he said simply. You were right, I was wrong, and you had the courage to act anyway. That's exactly the kind of person I want on my senior team. Irene shook his hand, feeling the weight of the day finally settling on her shoulders. I just did what needed to be done. That's what makes you exceptional, Henrik replied. Most people know what needs to be done. Very few actually do it, especially when authority figures tell them they're wrong. He moved toward the door, then paused. Go home, Irene. You've earned it. And when you come back, we'll start building a better security culture here. One where people like you are heard the first time, not the third time. As Irene gathered her things and headed for the exit, she felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride in what she'd accomplished. Anger that it had taken a near disaster for her warnings to be taken seriously. Relief that she still had her job, and apparently a better one. And underneath it all, a bone-deep exhaustion. The evening air was cool as she stepped outside. The sun was setting over Brussels, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Her phone buzzed, messages from colleagues congratulating her, checking if she was okay. She'd respond later. Right now, she just wanted to walk, to let her mind process everything that had happened. 3 hours. That's how long it had taken between Henrik dismissing her audit and the moment she stopped the breach. 3 hours that could have changed everything. Irene didn't go straight home. Instead, she found herself walking through Parc du Cinquantenaire, needing the open space and greenery to clear her head. The park was quiet at this hour, with only a few joggers and people walking dogs. She sat on a bench near the triumphal arch, watching the last rays of sunlight illuminate the monument's columns. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her mother calling from Milan. Irene hesitated, then answered. Ciao, Mama, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Irene, Cara, you sound exhausted. What's wrong? Her mother had always been able to read her, even across hundreds of kilometers and through a phone line. It's been a very long day. Irene found herself explaining everything, the dismissed audit, the attack, Gerard's betrayal, the confrontation, Henrik's apology. Her mother listened without interrupting, the way she always did when Irene needed to process something difficult. And how do you feel now? Her mother asked when Irene finished. I don't know. Relieved? Angry? Proud? All of it at once? Irene watched a couple walking their dog, envying their simple, peaceful evening. I was right, Mama. I knew I was right. But everyone acted like I was overreacting, like I was just some emotional young woman who couldn't handle the pressure. But you were right, her mother said firmly. And you trusted yourself even when others didn't. That takes strength, Tesoro. It shouldn't have to take a crisis for people to listen, Irene said, feeling tears finally threaten. I did everything correctly. I documented everything, presented evidence, followed proper channels. And it wasn't enough until the building was literally on fire. I know, her mother said softly. Your father dealt with the same thing when he was a young engineer. Being right isn't always enough. Sometimes you have to be right and loud and persistent, even when it's exhausting. Irene wiped her eyes, grateful no one was close enough to see. The worst part is, I shouldn't have had to violate protocol and risk my job to protect the company. If Henrik had just listened this morning, none of the crisis would have happened. But it did happen, and you handled it brilliantly, her mother countered. Yes, it's frustrating that your expertise wasn't recognized immediately. But you showed everyone what you're capable of. That matters. They talked for another 20 minutes, her mother's steady voice grounding Irene until she felt capable of going home. As she walked through the darkening streets toward her apartment in Excel, she thought about what came next. The promotion was gratifying, but it also meant more responsibility, more pressure, more opportunities to be dismissed or doubted. Her apartment was small but comfortable, filled with books and plants and the organized chaos of someone who lived alone and liked it that way. She made herself tea, changed into comfortable clothes, and opened her laptop. Despite her exhaustion, she needed to document everything while it was fresh in her mind. She wrote for 2 hours, creating a detailed timeline of events, her decision-making process, the technical details of both the vulnerability and Gerard's attack. Not for any official report, she'd already provided those, but for herself. A reminder that she'd trusted her instincts and been proven right. A record she could look back on during future moments of doubt. When she finally closed her laptop, it was nearly midnight. She should sleep, but her mind was still racing. She made another cup of tea and stood by her window, looking out at the neighborhood. Lights glowed in windows across the street. People were having dinner, watching television, living their ordinary lives. None of them knew how close Sentinel Data Solutions had come to a catastrophic breach today. None of them knew about the young analyst who'd stopped it. That was fine. Irene didn't need public recognition. But she did need to know, deep in her bones, that she'd done the right thing. That when it mattered most, she'd chosen courage over comfort, action over protocol, and herself over authority. Her phone buzzed one more time. A text from Thomas. Legal just confirmed Gerard was working for Titan Security Group, our biggest competitor. They wanted our client list and security protocols. You literally saved the company. Sleep well, hero. Irene smiled despite herself. Maybe she would sleep well after all. Thursday morning arrived with rain pattering against Irene's windows, a stark contrast to the sunny weather of the previous day. Despite Henrik's instruction to take the day off, Irene found herself unable to stay away. By 9 o'clock, she was back at the office, carrying 2 coffees and a determination to help with the audit. The office atmosphere had completely changed. Where before there had been casual efficiency, now there was focused intensity. Everyone knew about Gerard's attempted breach. Everyone knew about Irene's intervention. As she walked to her desk, colleagues she barely knew nodded respectfully. Some even stopped to thank her. I thought Henrik told you to take the day off, Thomas said, looking up from his computer where multiple terminal windows displayed ongoing system scans. I couldn't sleep in while everyone else is dealing with the aftermath, Irene replied, handing him one of the coffees. What have we found? Thomas accepted the coffee gratefully. 3 additional backdoors that Gerard planted over the past month. He was thorough, I'll give him that. Laura and James have been here since 6 a.m. purging them. We're also finding evidence that he exfiltrated data, client contact information, security protocols, even some of our proprietary threat assessment tools. Irene felt her stomach sink. How much data? Still quantifying it, but significant. Legal is drafting notifications for affected clients. It's going to be a nightmare. Thomas rubbed his eyes. The good news is that because you stopped him yesterday, he never got the permanent backdoor installed. Whatever damage was done, it's contained. Without that authentication bypass, his employers can't get back in. Henrik emerged from his office, looking haggard. When he saw Irene, his expression shifted to something between relief and exasperation. I told you to take the day off. I know, sir. But I thought I could help with the audit. Henrik studied her for a moment, then gestured toward his office. Come with me. There's something you need to know. Inside his office, Laura and James were already present, along with someone Irene didn't recognize, a woman in her 50s wearing an expensive suit, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Irene Hill, this is Victoria Dubois, our Chief Information Security Officer," Henrik said. "She's been traveling for the past week, which is why you haven't met her before." Victoria extended her hand, her grip firm. "Ms. Hill, I've been reading your audit report and Henrik's account of yesterday's events. Impressive work." "Thank you, ma'am," Irene said, wondering why the CISO's presence made her nervous. "I've also been reviewing our security team's structure and protocols," Victoria continued, settling into a chair. "Yesterday's incident revealed significant gaps in our approach. Henrik, you've been running the security team well, but it's clear we need changes in how we identify and respond to threats." Henrik nodded, his expression carefully neutral. Irene sensed there was history here, a dynamic she didn't fully understand. "I'm creating a new position," Victoria said, turning her full attention to Irene. "Director of Threat Intelligence and Response. This person will have authority to implement emergency security measures without waiting for committee approval. They'll lead a team focused specifically on identifying vulnerabilities, monitoring threats, and coordinating rapid response to security incidents." Irene's pulse quickened. She had a feeling where this was going. "Henrik has recommended you for this position," Victoria continued. "It would be a significant jump. You'd go from analyst to director, skipping several intermediate levels. You'd have 4 people reporting to you initially, with budget to expand the team as needed. You'd also have a seat at executive briefings and direct access to me for critical issues." The room was silent. Irene looked at Henrik, who gave her an encouraging nod. "I know it's a big step," he said. "But yesterday proved you have the technical skills, the judgment, and the courage for it. We need someone who won't back down when they identify a real threat." "I'm 26, Irene heard herself say. "I've been here less than 2 years. There are analysts with 10 times my experience." "Experience didn't stop this attack," Victoria said bluntly. "You did. Experience didn't identify Gerard's suspicious behavior. You did. I'm not interested in promoting based on years served. I'm interested in results." She leaned forward. "Yesterday, you made a decision that could have cost you your job. You chose to protect the company over protecting yourself. That's the kind of leadership we need." "Can I think about it?" Irene asked, her mind spinning. "Of course," Victoria said. "But not too long. We need this position filled by next week. If you decline, we'll begin an external search, but you're my first choice." She stood, signaling the meeting was over. "Henrik, continue the audit. Laura, James, I want a complete report on Gerard's activities by tomorrow. Irene, I'll need your answer by Monday." Irene spent the rest of Thursday in a daze, mechanically helping with the audit while her mind wrestled with the decision. Director of Threat Intelligence. It was the kind of position people worked decades to achieve. It was also the kind of position that came with enormous pressure, constant scrutiny, and no room for error. At lunch, she escaped to a nearby cafe, needing distance from the office to think clearly. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets wet and gleaming. She ordered a sandwich she didn't eat and stared at her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for. Professor Martins had been her mentor at university, the person who'd encouraged her to pursue cybersecurity when she'd been uncertain about her path. They'd stayed in touch, meeting for coffee every few months. She called him now. "Irene," his warm voice answered. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" She explained the situation, all of it, from the dismissed audit to the breach to the unexpected promotion. Professor Martins listened thoughtfully, asking occasional questions but mostly letting her talk. "So the question is whether I'm ready for this," Irene concluded. "Whether I can handle that kind of responsibility." "Wrong question," Professor Martins said gently. "The question is whether you're willing to try. There's no such thing as being fully ready for opportunities like this. You grow into them. But what if I fail? What if I make a decision like yesterday and I'm wrong? Then you'll learn from it, just like every other leader who's ever made a mistake. Professor Martins paused. Irene, do you remember what you told me when you were deciding whether to pursue cybersecurity? You said you wanted to protect people, to be the person who stopped bad things from happening. This position lets you do exactly that, just at a larger scale. It's terrifying, Irene admitted. Good. If it wasn't terrifying, it wouldn't be worth doing. She could hear the smile in his voice. You've already proven you can handle the pressure. Yesterday, when everyone told you were wrong, you trusted yourself. That's the hardest part of leadership, having the confidence to act on your convictions even when you're standing alone. After they hung up, Irene sat in the cafe for another hour, watching people pass by on the street. Young professionals rushing to meetings. Students laughing over lunch. An elderly couple walking slowly, holding hands. All of them trusting that the digital infrastructure supporting their lives was secure, never thinking about the analysts and engineers working to keep it that way. She thought about Gerard, about how close he'd come to succeeding. She thought about all the other Gerard Rousseaus out there, working for competitors or criminal organizations or foreign governments, looking for vulnerabilities to exploit. She thought about the next threat, the next attack, the next crisis that no one saw coming. Someone needed to be watching for those threats. Someone needed to have the authority and courage to act when others hesitated. Yesterday had proven she could be that person. The question was whether she was willing to accept that responsibility. By the time she returned to the office, she'd made her decision. She found Victoria in a meeting with Henrik and the legal team, discussing client notifications. Irene waited until they took a break, then caught Victoria in the hallway. I'll do it, Irene said. The director position. I accept. Victoria's stern expression softened into something approaching approval. Good. We'll make it official Monday, but you can start planning your team structure now. I want your vision for the department by end of next week, budget requirements, personnel needs, technology investments, everything. There's one condition, Irene said, her heart pounding but her voice steady. Victoria raised an eyebrow. You're in no position to negotiate conditions. With respect, ma'am, I'm in the perfect position. You need me for this role, which means I can ask for what I need to do it effectively. Irene held her ground. I want direct authority to implement emergency security measures without approval when the threat is imminent. No committees, no waiting for consensus. If I identify a critical vulnerability or active attack, I need to be able to act immediately. That's a lot of authority for someone so young, Victoria said, her tone neutral. Yesterday proved why it's necessary, Irene countered. If I'd waited for approval, Gerard would have succeeded. The next time, we might not have 3 hours warning. We might have 3 minutes. Victoria studied her for a long moment. You'll have to justify every decision afterward. If you're wrong, if you cause unnecessary disruption, there will be consequences. I understand. And you'll need to develop protocols for determining when immediate action is warranted versus when you should consult the team. I'll have that in my proposal next week. Victoria extended her hand again. Welcome to leadership, Ms. Hill. I think you're going to be excellent at it. As Irene shook her hand, she felt the weight of what she'd just accepted. No more being the analyst who identified problems for others to solve. Now she would be responsible for the solutions. Now she would be the one others looked to in a crisis. It was terrifying. It was overwhelming. It was exactly what she wanted. Friday morning brought clear skies and a sense of new beginning. Irene arrived early again, but this time she went straight to Victoria's office. The CISO was already there, working through emails with the focused intensity of someone who'd managed crises for decades. Ready to start? Victoria asked, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Yes, ma'am. Irene had spent the previous evening outlining her initial thoughts for the department structure. She pulled out her tablet. I've been thinking about what went wrong with Gerard's case and how we can prevent similar situations. Go on, Victoria said, closing her laptop to give Irene her full attention. The fundamental problem was that we had no systematic way to monitor internal threats. We focused almost entirely on external attacks. Gerard had legitimate access to everything he needed. We gave it to him because he was an employee. We need a system that monitors not just what people access, but the patterns of their access. Irene pulled up her preliminary design. I'm proposing a 3-tier approach. First tier is automated monitoring, AI-driven analysis of access patterns, looking for anomalies. Second tier is human review, analysts examining flagged behaviors to determine if they're genuine threats or false positives. Third tier is rapid response. When a threat is confirmed, we have protocols for immediate containment and investigation. Victoria leaned forward, studying the design. This would require significant investment in monitoring technology. You're talking about logging and analyzing every system access by every employee. I know it raises privacy concerns, Irene acknowledged. But we can build it with appropriate safeguards. Automated monitoring only flags statistical anomalies, unusual times, unusual access patterns, unusual data volumes. Human analysts only review flagged activities, not routine work. And we build an oversight to prevent abuse. Privacy isn't my main concern, effectiveness is, Victoria said. I've seen too many monitoring systems that generate so many alerts that analysts ignore them. How do you prevent alert fatigue? By making the AI smarter, Irene replied. Machine learning that understands normal behavior patterns for each role. The system learns what's typical for a systems administrator versus a security analyst versus a developer. It only alerts on behaviors that are anomalous for that specific role and individual. Victoria nodded slowly. Expensive, but potentially very effective. What else? A vulnerability response protocol. Clear criteria for what constitutes a critical threat requiring immediate action versus what can go through normal review processes. Written authority for designated personnel to implement emergency measures. And mandatory post-action review. Every time someone uses emergency authority, we document why, what was done, and whether it was justified. Accountability, Victoria said approvingly. Essential for making this work. If you're wrong, you need to own it. Exactly. And we learn from mistakes rather than punishing people for making judgment calls. Irene hesitated, then continued. There's one more thing. We need to change the culture around reporting concerns. Henrik dismissed my audit because he thought I was overreacting. That needs to never happen again. You want to change Henrik, Victoria said, a slight smile playing at her lips. I want to change how the entire organization handles security concerns. When someone identifies a potential vulnerability, even if it turns out to be nothing, they should be thanked for their diligence, not made to feel like they're crying wolf. Irene met Victoria's eyes. People need to feel safe raising alarms, even false ones. Because the one time they stay silent could be the time that destroys us. Victoria was quiet for a moment, then nodded decisively. All right. You have budget approval for the monitoring system, work with procurement to get quotes from vendors. You have authority to hire 3 additional analysts for your team immediately. And I'll schedule a company-wide meeting next week where we announce the new department and the culture changes around security reporting. Thank you, Irene said, relief flooding through her. Don't thank me yet, Victoria replied. You now have the hardest job in the company. You're responsible for protecting us from threats we can't see, from people we trust, from attacks we haven't imagined yet. It's exhausting, thankless work, and you'll be second-guessed constantly. I know, Irene said quietly. But it's also the most important work we do, Victoria continued, her expression softening slightly. Everything else, sales, marketing, development, none of it matters if we can't keep our clients' data secure. You're the last line of defense. And based on what happened this week, you're exactly the person I want in that position. The following Monday, Irene stood before the entire company in the main conference hall. Her palms were sweaty, her heart racing, but her voice remained steady as Victoria introduced her new role. 200 employees looked back at her, some curious, some skeptical, some openly supportive. "Most of you know what happened last week," Irene began, deciding to address it directly rather than dance around it. "We came very close to a catastrophic breach. An insider threat that we failed to detect until it was almost too late. I want to talk about why that happened and what we're going to do differently." She clicked to her first slide, showing Gerard's access patterns highlighted in red against normal employee behavior in blue. Gerard Rousseau had legitimate access to sensitive systems. He used that access to systematically map our security infrastructure over 6 months. We didn't notice because we were focused on external threats while the danger was already inside our walls. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Irene continued. "This isn't about blame. It's about learning. We had the data to detect Gerard's activities, but we didn't have systems in place to analyze that data effectively. That changes now." She outlined the new threat intelligence and response department, the monitoring systems, the vulnerability protocols. But she spent most of her time on the cultural changes. "I need everyone in this company to understand something crucial. If you see something suspicious, report it. If you identify a potential vulnerability, speak up. Even if you're not sure. Even if you think you might be wrong. Especially if you think someone might dismiss your concerns." She paused, making eye contact with Henrik, who sat in the front row. "Last Tuesday morning, I presented a security audit identifying a critical vulnerability. My supervisor dismissed it as theoretical paranoia. 3 hours later, that vulnerability was actively being exploited. If I hadn't acted without authorization, we would have lost everything." The room was completely silent now. "I'm not telling you this to embarrass anyone," Irene said gently. "I'm telling you because it illustrates a problem we need to fix. When someone raises a security concern, our first instinct should be to investigate, not to dismiss. We should err on the side of caution, not convenience." Henrik stood up, and Irene tensed, unsure what he would say. "Irene is right," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "I made a serious error in judgment. I let my ego and assumptions override good security practice. I'm committed to doing better, and I hope all of you will hold me accountable to that." As they headed back inside, Irene thought about how far she'd come in 3 months. From dismissed analyst to department director. From being told she was overreacting to being trusted with the company's most critical security decisions. The journey had been intense, challenging, sometimes painful. But standing here now, knowing she was making a real difference, she wouldn't change a thing. Her phone buzzed, a security alert. She glanced at it, quickly assessed the severity, and sent instructions to her team. Just another day protecting the company, watching for threats, staying vigilant. It was exhausting work, just as Victoria had warned. But it was also exactly where Irene belonged. She smiled and kept walking, ready for whatever came next. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.